Like so many of you, when I first set up my workshop, I had to decide how best to store all of my tools. And back then I chose the French Cleat wall system, but now lots of people are telling me that I chose wrong. But what they don't know is I've spent the last 4 years improving it. And so today we're going to be combining time, space and money saving tips with answering the most asked questions, not only from my videos but from the internet as a whole. All with the aim that by the end of this video, you'll be ready to start building your own or adapting your already existing French Cleat wall to far better suit your workshop tool storage needs. But possibly more important than that, I'm going to tell you how to counteract the biggest mistake that holds back 90% of French Cleat walls from ever reaching their full potential. 5 tips in all and a ton of questions answered. Here's the first. Tip 1. Let's start at the start. Build your wall first and then build the holders. The biggest mistake I see beginners make is they try and design all of the holders that they think they're going to need before they've even started on the wall. Not only don't you know how much space you've got to work with, but also it makes the job feel huge, and that can be quite daunting, and in worst cases that'll stop you ever starting. Build the part of your French Cleat wall that you need the most first. Then start using it. Make the holders in order of priority. What do you use most? Make that holder first. And then make and add holders as you need them. Also, don't over cleat. You don't need your cleats to go all the way down to the floor because your bottom cleat is probably going to have something hanging off it. So what I've done with mine is I've stopped somewhere between 1.5 and 2 feet off the ground, and then I make sure that anything hanging off leaves enough space for at least a broom to be able to get under to clear any dust away. Place your French cleats where it makes the most sense within your workflow, like for me, right here by my main workbench. Now this leads me nicely into the first question. What materials and dimensions should I use? Here's the most common recommendation, 3/4 inch ply, because it's strong and durable. But personally what I use is 12mm or 1/2 inch ply, mainly because it's cheaper, lighter and still plenty strong enough for workshop use. But so you can consider the differences for yourself, here's the trade-off. You lose a bit of the bite and the friction from having the thicker 3/4 inch battens. So with 3/4 inch, your holders are going to feel a little bit more snug and secure. But if you consider that your French Cleat wall is going to be mainly smaller holders with hand tools and some smaller power tools, 1/2 inch ply is going to be absolutely fine. My tool cabinet with 250 tools that is fixed to the back wall permanently, that uses 3/4 inch ply. It's worth noting at this point they're not interchangeable. So though a holder with a 3/4 inch ply French Cleat bracket on it will technically go on this French Cleat wall, it's not going to be a great fit, and vice versa. Tip number 2, cutting the cleat. My opinion, there are 3 ways of making this cut. You could use a table saw, a track saw, or a circular saw. Now you're going to find the table saw is the quickest, the easiest, and the most consistent. And then a little bit behind that is the track saw, and then at the bottom of the list is the circular saw. But in a pinch, it will get the job done. It's just a little bit more tricky to keep it consistent. You might find the blade wanders a little bit and the setup time does add to the overall time of the job. Here's a useful shortcut. Instead of constantly adjusting the saw, and this is probably more the case in a circular saw, but equally with a table saw too, where for my main cleats I kept swapping between a 45° and a 90° to cut each cleat perfectly, why not leave your saw at 45° and either cut 2 opposing angles by just flipping the board, or cut 2 parallel angles. That way you don't have to adjust the saw at all. But here's a safety concern, especially with the table saw. Be very mindful of kickback. Don't do what I do. Stand in the right place because your cleat will become the offcut and it will be underneath the saw blade, far easier to get pinched. And if you're cutting long boards and it starts to wander as it goes through the table saw, which can be quite a common problem, why not just make the switch to shorter cleats, because when they're up on the wall, you won't be able to tell if it's one long cleat or a number of short ones. And cut your first one. Test you've actually got it at 45, test that it's straight before you go out and batch all the others. And this does bring up another important question. What angle should the cleats actually be cut at? There's not one definitive answer. The answer really is you can be flexible. You could cut them anywhere between 30 and 45°, but 45° like this is generally the standard. It gives a strong mechanical lock, a nice secure fit, and it's a nice easy angle to cut accurately. Here's a quick tip for getting the best fit. If you're using a wide board to cut multiple cleats, the best fit you're going to get, cleat for cleat, is taking both sides of the same cut. So for instance, if this cleat has been cut away from this board, leaving a 45° angle, the next cleat that I cut will have the best fit angle for angle. I mean, this is a perfect scenario, but it's not possible in the real world where you're going to batch out multiple cleats. And after cutting lightly, hand plane or sand the sharp edge on the top of the angled part of the cleat. It's going to prevent splintering and it's going to give a tighter, more forgiving fit, but it's also going to have a far larger benefit later on. We'll get to that pretty soon. Tip 3. When installing the rows of cleats, use 2 spacer blocks, one at each end. That way you're going to keep the spacing perfectly consistent. Not only that, but it's going to speed up the installation. It's going to keep everything aligned. It's going to stop the risk of wonky cleats. So cut 2 blocks, label them, stick them in a drawer, use them for whenever you want to expand your cleat wall. Question number 3. Do you absolutely need a backer board? Honestly, the answer is no. You can screw your cleats directly into the wall, either into raw plugs or studs, depending on what your walls are made of. Either that or a backer board, either way is going to work. But I recommend a backer board for the following reasons. Screwing them to a backer board is going to make your installation a lot easier. And not only can you screw the cleats to the board, you can glue the full length of the cleat to the wooden backer board too. And if you screw from the back of the backer board into the cleat, making sure you've got the right length screws to leave enough in the wood, it's going to give you a much cleaner aesthetic. And should you ever want to take the French cleat system down, either to move it to another workshop or lose it completely, not only is it easier, quicker, but it also leaves less mess behind. And if you've got an awkwardly laid out workshop a bit like mine, with plugs raised off the ground, any small gaps, we just make smaller backer boards with the French cleats on them to fit the gaps. And as a follow-up bit of information, a lot of people question the amount of weight that a French cleat wall can actually take. It's a little bit tricky, to be honest, because the cleats are only really as strong as the fixings, either the fixings to the backer board or the fixings of the backer board into the studs, or the fixings of the studs themselves. Because my opinion is if you cut a cleat correctly and give it enough size, that's never going to break. So what you have to do, no matter how you attach the cleats, be it through a backer board or into the stud directly, make sure the fixing is as strong as you can do. And don't neglect the mating cleat that goes on the tool holder. That needs to be fixed on properly too, because in my opinion, if you don't glue that to the holder and you only screw it, that's probably the weakest part of the entire setup. Everything you see on my French cleat wall so far has never had an issue. Nothing has taken the leap off the wall. And tip number 4, decide what actually belongs on the wall. Before grabbing your scrap wood and making your holders, think about which tool deserves the space on your wall. And with that, here's a few things to avoid putting on the wall in the first place. Hardware like screws and nails, stick them in a drawer. Rarely used tools, no matter how attractive they are, put them in a drawer. Very large tools, put them in a drawer or a cabinet too. Anything that dust is going to stick to and is really hard to get off, that belongs in a drawer. And it is pointless putting static cabinets on your French cleat wall. If they're not going to move around, they can still be mounted on a French cleat, which makes it significantly stronger and easier. But if they're not going to be moved, keep them off the French cleat wall. So here are the good candidates for the French cleat wall. Ones that you're going to pick up for a job, replace back on the wall and go back for sometime at least this side of Christmas. Things like your hand planes, saws, chisels, marking tools, clamps, hammers and mallets, gloves, rags, card scrapers. As I said, anything that you pick up and use regularly. Once you've picked them, then organise them by workflow. I've got my most used tools right here by my most used work area. And then, as you go down the French cleat wall further away from their workplace, they become less and less used. And don't forget, nothing is permanent. That's the strength of this French cleat wall system. As what you're making changes, as your skills grow, as your tool collection grows, you'll find things gradually moving further down that wall until when they get to the end, well, that's when they go in a drawer or a cabinet. But there is one big gripe that a lot of people have: dust. Question number 4, is dust a problem? I can only really give you my experience here, and it does come with a caveat. I've never had a big issue with tons of dust collecting on my tools. But here's the caveat: I move these tools around by using them a lot. And I've worked really hard on the dust collection in this workshop. And as much as I hate to say it, I clean up regularly. So it is worth considering your workshop situation before committing. Some people will suggest that you pop some spacers behind the cleats themselves. That way any dust that collects can fall straight through onto the ground. Personally, I'm not too big a fan of this approach. As someone who's glued their cleats to the backer board, I think putting spacers in loses a lot of glue area and can potentially weaken the cleat. So here's a couple of things you can do instead. I mentioned before planing off the sharp edge. Don't just do it to the wall cleat, do it to the mating cleat on the holder itself too. That way when they join together, there's going to be a tiny dust gap between them.
Or use brackets or mounting systems much like these, because there's a much smaller point of contact than if you have the full French cleat batten. I'm not going to dwell on these for too long. I've used laser cut ones out of ply, and I've got these 3D printed ones here. For those of you in the US, I'll leave a link down in the description for a glimpse inside who sells them over in the US. For those of you with a 3D printer, I'll leave a link in the description for the files for these. For those of you without a 3D printer using regular batten cleats, every few months take a mini leaf blower and just blow the wall clear of dust. Open the doors, wear a mask, let the dust all settle everywhere else in the workshop, and then just give the whole place a vacuum. Doesn't take as long as it sounds, and it'll solve the problem.
The next tip is a large series of tips all in one, and it's all based around the tool holders. And what we're going to start with is the biggest tip in the whole video, the one I alluded to at the start, because it is the biggest reason for anybody who's dismissed the French cleat wall system. Don't treat it like a pegboard. It is far more than that. Most people line their tools up flat against their tool wall like some display shelf. Instead, think of the wall as a 3D storage box, almost like a floor-to-ceiling full wall of shallow cabinets. Here's why. So if even one of these holders sticks out a foot from the wall, you're going to be unable to walk past it anyway. So the whole area around that holder is already using that space effectively. So you may as well increase your depth of thinking and fill it efficiently. Thinking in this 3D box way will increase your storage potential exponentially. Here's what I mean. Use multiple tiered holders and stacking arrangements. Take my 3-tiered chisel holder for instance. This is the same number of chisels stored flat as this in a tiered holder. That takes up almost a third of the space because we're thinking 3D. These store 7 clamps in the same space you'd normally have maybe 2. So consider this rather than having them all stored flat. Make custom holders that maximize depth from the shelf, much like these handplane shelves, because you could make them the depth of 1 and it's going to take up the same amount of space as the depth of 2. And while I've got this out, make holders where the accessories are right next to the tool they're used for. So in this drawer is everything related to what I need for the handplanes. And as an aside, a French cleat shelf, like I would have needed for these planes, takes up the same amount of room as a shelf with a drawer in it. So put a drawer under every shelf. You're going to put the accessories in there anyway. Bigger isn't always better. Smaller can be better too. So rather than combining loads of different types of tools in a holder so you only have to make one, keep them on their own holders because there's going to be lots of little gaps on a French cleat wall that these will fill nicely. And finally, for the 3D thinking approach, you don't hold tools and grab at them from the side, not generally. So stop storing them like that. Stop displaying them flat on a shelf. It takes up loads more room and it's not the ergonomically easiest way of grabbing that tool. Have them coming away from the wall because then when you grab them, they're in the right position to use and put back. And there's another shelf with a drawer in it for all the jigsaw blades. Let's just quickly reel off the remaining tool holder tips. Don't be afraid to make your tool holders out of scrap wood. They don't have to be beautiful. But if you do want to add a fancier look, just glue a nice bit of hardwood on the front to hide all the scrap wood. Design holders around the motion needed to remove that tool, and then stack the wall with that in mind. And then if there's any holders that are at risk of coming away from the wall with the tool, much like these clamp brackets, lock them on. You can use a simple block or a wedge on the underside of the cleat itself, or a well-placed dowel or screw will do the job just as well. And then design some tool holders so they're removable so you can take them to the project. But for this you may need to design the tool holder so if you're going to put it on your workbench it will actually sit flat rather than fall over. But before you do that, the answer to the next question might mean that you don't have to. Question 5, what's the best holder you've ever made? For me, it's probably this, the Everyday Carry tool holder. Basically, a tool shelf for everything that I use on every single project. And not only is it all together on the wall, well, I can take it off the wall and I can take it to my projects. And I'm down here to tell you about that in a second. Because the second question is, what is the best addition I've made to the French cleat wall? And the answer is not technically on the French cleat wall. The answer is right here on the edge of my workbench. Because the best addition I've done is putting a French cleat right on the side of my workbench. And I would urge you to do it too, because then things like your everyday carry shelf can just go on the side of your workbench, out of the way, keeping your workbench clear,
while still having the tools right there when you need them. And it doesn't just have to be tool shelves. You could just put some container boxes there so that if you need to shove anything down into them, again, that's out of the way, keeping this space clear for you to build on. And now let's finish up with the most frequently asked questions, not only from my videos, but from the internet as a whole. What's the biggest French cleat mistake that people make? There's a couple that spring to mind straight away. First of all, it's human nature for us woodworkers to want to save wood. And as a result, a lot of people space their cleats too far apart. The problem with this is you lose stability and flexibility. You see, there's a sweet spot, and this is just my take. Your cleats need to be wide enough to be strong, narrow enough to not waste wood, far enough apart so you can easily get the mating cleat in between them, but also close enough to offer support to whatever is attached on the batten above to stop the actual holder itself from rocking. In short, there's no exact science, but consider all those things and you won't go far wrong. This does tie in nicely with another big mistake, not supporting the bottom of the holders with a spacer or a batten. Take this 3D printed cleat here. This batten here is just as important as the cleat up on the top, because this is the reason it doesn't tip and fall off the wall. And the last mistake that we've talked about a lot, treating the wall as a whole like a pegboard instead of like a 3D box. Is plywood better than solid wood for making your cleats from? Yes. Generally speaking, solid wood, hardwood or softwood, they move with the seasons and they can tend to warp, especially cheap pine. Plus, if you've ever cut a long board of any solid hardwood into 2 long pieces, you'll probably already experienced the releasing of the tension that's held within it. It's far more likely to bend and bow once you've cut it. Whereas plywood is cheaper and more stable, much more predictable, you know what you're getting. And just for information, I would use it above MDF, chipboard or OSB. Would you build it differently today? I do have a couple of regrets. I've got 3 sets of double plug sockets around 1.5 feet off the floor along just this wall. And when I fitted the backer board and the cleats, I left huge gaps around these plugs. And so I've tied myself down to the fact that only my wide shelves can go past them because they can straddle from where one cleat ends to where the other one starts. I wish I'd have planned better. Another regret, I wish I'd continued my wall up another 2 levels of cleats, because there's a lot of wasted space up high. But the flexibility of the system does mean that if I wanted to, I could fix these anytime. This is a brutally honest one. Which holder was a complete waste of time? There's a couple. First of all, these boxes. All it is a box with a long cleat on the back. Trouble is, because you've got no support below it, they wobble and they just keep falling off. Far better to have a bit more depth to it and have a cleat bracket on the top with one of these support battens on the bottom, or have it deep enough for a French cleat and a batten so it sits better on the wall. I made about 7 of those. And this is one of the first tool holders I ever made. And all I wanted to do was to display every spoke shave that I owned. And I did. However, I only frequently use one. So this should be on a cleat with something else. These should be in a drawer. They don't need their own holder. But that's another advantage of the French cleat system. Tool holders that are either wrong or you've grown out of can just be replaced. But as we come towards the end of the video, I think there is one point that 90% of YouTubers especially, but woodworkers as a whole, miss. Remember, we don't all work the same, and our workshops all look completely different. French cleats may not be as efficient as cabinets. It may not be as well organised as drawers. It may get dustier than both of the two. And some of the holders may look a little bit rough. But here's the point that the majority of people miss. The real value in this is that there is always something to tweak, improve and build. The days when you don't have the time or the patience to either start or carry on with a major project, a 30-minute tool holder build can feel like a real win. And it's a real win that still gets you to come into your workshop. For anybody who feels that that's difficult to do some days, I understand. That's why I appreciate the little wins like building these tool holders. So don't overthink it. Move things around, make a few holders, replace the bad ones and enjoy the process. And above all else, enjoy being in your workshop. I hope this has been helpful, or at least enjoyable. If you want to see the original where a lot of this came from, a lot of the holders got built, it's up there. As always, thank you to my patrons for their support. Thank you to you for watching. And if you click on this one or any of my other videos, I'll see you over there. Thanks a lot.